This video is about relating the business cycle to our ASAD model. So here's our business cycle kind of played out. We have our trend line and we have the cycle. So we have expansionary periods, so that's kind of where mine starts. So we're in expansion and then the economy hits a peak and then it begins their long road down recession and then ends with a trough and then continues on with expansion and peak and recession and trough again. So in the business cycle, we can relate the various phases, expansionary periods, peak periods, and recessionary periods on our ASAD model. And we're going to need to be adept at identifying when an economy is in those three phases of the business cycle and then how to draw the ASAD model graph to explain it. Later on, we'll talk about how various groups of people, whether it's government or elsewhere, can fix the economy. That is in either a peak or a recession, which are two places where we don't want to be. We want to be in a nice, even expansion if possible. So we'll talk later on about how government tries to promote that trend line growth. So here we have our kind of chart with GDP, inflation, and unemployment on the left, and then kind of the ideas in an ideal economy, which is expansionary period, a recession, which in the business cycle obviously is the recession, and then the peak period from the business cycle. So starting off with the ideal numbers for GDP, inflation, and unemployment. So the ideal numbers for GDP is between 2 and 4% as a target for real GDP growth rate. Anywhere in that range is considered ideal or acceptable in an expansionary period. Inflationary targeting is at 2%, but we say a good range is between 1 and 3%. That's acceptable inflation rates. We want to keep those rates low, remember. And then the idea of unemployment in an ideal or an expansionary phase of the business cycle would be at full employment, which is 5%. Then any deviation from those numbers, especially drastically so, is either going to be, for the most part, other than a stagflation period we'll talk about later, is either a recession or a peak. So in a recession, if we kind of start at the bottom in this case, in a recession, unemployment rates tend to be high, much greater than 5%. So we might say something like greater than 7%. Greater than 7%. Unemployment is going to be problematic and indicative of a recession. So because there's a lot of unemployed workers, we're going to notice that for the most part, GDP is going to be low or negative. So it's going to be much lower than that target rate. So it's either going to be low or negative. And a lot of times because people lose their jobs, less people working is going to mean less production, so GDP falls oftentimes in a recession. And because people are losing their jobs and they're having less income, inflation tends to be low, usually below that 1% bottom threshold. Sometimes it can be negative. We can see deflation during recession. And the reason behind that is if people don't have a lot of expendable income, you certainly can't raise prices on them, or you don't want to because it's going to go unsold. So inflation tends to be low during a recession. The key figures here, the key identifying factors of a recession are high unemployment and low or negative GDP growth. Whereas in a peak, the key to knowing whether we're in an inflationary period is if there's high inflation. So we might notice like in the 1970s and 80s, we had double-digit inflationary periods within a year. We might have 8, 9, 10, 11% inflation would be indicative of a peak. Now, GDP can pretty much be anything during a peak. It could be leveling off, so it could have maybe grown 7% last year, and now it's at 0% or right around there. We're kind of like, if you can picture that business cycle, we're kind of turning the corner. So the economy was expanding, and now we're about to hit a recession as prices rise too quickly. Consumers aren't going to be able to afford very much in the future, so spending is going to fall, and we'll talk about how that works later on. And then unemployment tends to be low. Somewhere around that 5% full employment, maybe it's a little bit lower. The idea of a peak is that, getting to our model of ASAD is that the economy has been picking up, consumers are spending more and more, so aggregate demand has been increasing for a long period of time. And as aggregate demand increases, the price level rises, and we have inflation. And that's basically what happens during a peak, is that aggregate demand has increased so much beyond our full employment output that that's what's going to happen. So here we have the makings of our economy, and we're going to start with the ideal, the expansionary phase. So what does the economy look like in an ideal situation or at full employment output? So we notice I've already put the LRAS curve on the graph to show that that's our full employment output, that's our potential output of the economy. So ideally, we want to produce there in the short run. So in the long run, we have the aggregate supply curve fixed at that real GDP rate. And so all we need to do then is to draw the short run aggregate supply and the aggregate demand curve to intersect at LRAS. So that current output equals, Y1 in this case, current output equals potential output. So the short run equilibrium is always the current output, and the LRAS is potential output. So in this case, current and potential output are equal. So now let's look at a recession. So we talked about there's high unemployment in a recession, so unemployment is high, and real GDP is falling. So instead of being at our ideal rate in the short run, we're now operating at a lower GDP. So Y1 is going to be to the left of Y star. So when we draw our short run equilibrium, there's my short run AS, and here's my AD curve, that you'll notice potential is greater than current output. So the economy is currently producing Y1 while potential output is Y star. So we've kind of indicated that we have unemployment and that PL1 and that we have lower GDP than what we are expecting or than what our potential is. So the idea with kind of a production possibility curve is in an ideal economy, like in the last slide, we're kind of operating at maximum capacity. We're operating on our production possibility curve. Now the idea on the production possibility curve is now we're down here in a recession. So we have these unemployed resources. We could be producing more, but there's problems, whatever those problems may be, that we have these idle resources. And then on the next slide, when we talk about peak, the peak is beyond. For a short period of time, we can produce beyond our production possibility curve, and we can produce beyond our full employment output, our Y star, our potential output. So now we get to a peak, the idea that inflation is high, inflation is rising. So it's going to be kind of greater than it should be, or than ideal at least. So we have our LRAS curve as always, indicating our potential economy. And then this time our short run equilibrium is going to be to the right of Y star. So we're producing beyond potential for a short period of time. And then you'll notice that a price level generally is pretty high, at least higher than kind of what we might consider to be normal-ish, a little bit lower price level than where we're at. And so once we kind of graph the different economies of being an ideal or expansionary phase, a recessionary phase, and a peak, in the next part of the unit we get into our first type of policy. So how can government fix high inflation and bring back down aggregate demand? And during a recession, how can government inject money into the circular flow and inject money into the economy and spend in order to get us out of a recession, and so to increase spending that way? But for now, what you should be able to do is to draw all three economies or all three stages in the economy as it relates to the business cycle. Expansion, where it's ideal, recession, where there's not enough production, and then a peak where there's high inflation.